Carlton and Keel did not approach Nicole like thieves kicking down a door. They approached her the way a skilled con approaches a vault, by convincing the lock it wants to open. Their collaboration was born from separate hungers that happened to fit together too well. Carlton wanted legitimacy, the kind that could not be bought outright because it depended on being seen as indispensable, respected, and above suspicion. Keel wanted leverage, the kind that turned other people's reputations into currency and made loyalty optional. Nicole, with her name, her standing, and the way she could move a room with a glance, represented both the prize and the mechanism. If they could steer her, they could steer everything connected to her. And in Fairmont Crest, nothing powerful existed alone. It existed in webs: family, philanthropy, business, romance, image. Carlton and Keel decided to pull at Nicole until the entire web tightened around her throat, and she wouldn't even know her own hands had tied the knot. They built their lie with patience, because patience is what separates a scandal from a takeover. Carlton played the role of calm reason, the steady presence who understood Nicole's public pressure and offered a private refuge that felt safe. He learned the exact angle of sympathy that made her soften without making her feel pitied. He understood the language of damage control, the way to speak about risk and strategy without sounding like he was manipulating her. Keel, meanwhile, worked in the seams, invisible where it mattered, present only as a convenient solution. He created a stream of small, plausible emergencies that made Nicole crave order. Minor financial anomalies, suspicious emails, an anonymous tip that suggested someone was targeting her interests. Nothing large enough to confirm panic, but enough to keep her slightly off balance. They did not need Nicole to break. They only needed her to hesitate, and then to reach for help in the direction they had quietly positioned themselves. Nicole had always relied on instinct as much as intelligence. Her anger had protected her too. Anger at being underestimated, anger at being told she was too emotional whenever she was simply too accurate. But anger was also the easiest emotion for someone like Carlton to redirect. He did it with elegance, feeding her suspicions of other people, pointing her gaze toward enemies who were real enough to be believable, but distant enough to be harmless. He made Nicole feel sharp, validated, and powerful, while guiding her away from seeing what was directly in front of her. Each time Nicole's intuition whispered that something wasn't right, Carlton turned that whisper into a different narrative, one where Nicole was being targeted by outsiders, one where her current stress was distorting her ability to trust, one where only careful allies could keep her safe. Nicole's fury, once a weapon she controlled, became a flame Carlton learned to aim. Keel's role was more brutal. He understood the simplest truth about powerful people. They believe they are immune until they feel their control slipping. So he designed situations that made Nicole feel that slip in tiny increments. A board member suddenly became uncooperative. A donor questioned her judgment. A business partner requested an unexpected audit. These events weren't catastrophic, but they were humiliating, and humiliation was the kind of pressure that pushed Nicole toward quick decisions. Keel didn't want Nicole to think slowly. He wanted her to move, to act, to cut corners under the belief that she was protecting her legacy. He orchestrated paperwork that looked clean, contracts that seemed standard, and schedules that forced Nicole to sign before she could fully examine. He built a maze where every exit led back to him, and then he watched Nicole run. What made the deception truly venomous was that it was personal by design. Carlton didn't just want to gain Nicole's trust, he wanted to become the emotional authority in her life, the person whose approval could calm her and whose disappointment could destabilize her. He was patient enough to let her feel in control, but strategic enough to make her dependence invisible until it was already a habit. Keel supported this by using information like a blade. He studied Nicole's vulnerabilities, not the obvious ones that everyone knew, but the private ones she hid from herself. Her fear of looking foolish, her fear of being betrayed again, her fear that every relationship was ultimately transactional. Keel fed Carlton the precise details needed to turn those fears into an emotional trap. Every time Nicole tried to set a boundary, an engineered crisis appeared that made the boundary feel selfish. Every time she tried to pull away, Carlton showed up with perfect timing, making her feel guilty for questioning him. Nicole's life began to feel like a room full of mirrors, and Carlton and Keel controlled where she saw herself reflected. Nicole's internal conflict sharpened into something corrosive. She sensed inconsistencies, small ones at first, like a document that used the wrong phrasing for something she had dealt with 100 times, or a timeline that didn't align with someone's claimed whereabouts. She began to notice how Keel's solutions always required access, how his help always came with a request. She began to see that Carlton's reassurance was almost too polished, too prepared, as if he had anticipated exactly what she would fear before she spoke it aloud. Her anger returned, but now it wasn't clean anger aimed at an enemy. It was messy anger aimed partly at herself. She hated that she might have been seduced by comfort. She hated that she might have wanted to believe in someone's loyalty badly enough to ignore her own instincts. She hated that the more she suspected them, the more she felt isolated, because admitting suspicion would mean admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability was a weakness her world punished. At the same time, Carlton and Keel began to feel the pressure of their own scheme tightening. Deception is addictive, but it also demands escalation. The longer they kept Nicole in the maze, the more they needed her to commit to choices she couldn't easily reverse. They began to push toward a final objective, a large move that would cement their advantage, something that would turn Nicole's authority into their property. Carlton wanted Nicole's public endorsement of a plan that would place him at the center of her power structure. Keel wanted access to information that could permanently control her, records, accounts, sensitive histories that could be used as blackmail. Their goals aligned, but not perfectly, and in that imperfect alignment, another danger emerged. They began to distrust each other. Carlton feared that Keel's hunger for leverage would become reckless. Keel feared that Carlton's need for legitimacy would make him sentimentality, and sentimentality was how operations collapsed. Their partnership, once efficient, began to show hairline fractures. They grew more controlling, more aggressive in how they managed Nicole's environment, and those aggressive moves made Nicole's instincts flare even harder. Keel pushed for speed. Carlton pushed for elegance. Keel wanted Nicole cornered. Carlton wanted Nicole convinced.
That difference mattered because Nicole was not a passive target. Nicole was a storm that could change direction quickly once she recognized the wind. Nicole's breaking point came in the form of a pattern she couldn't ignore. She realized that every problem that had appeared in her life recently did one consistent thing. It funneled her toward Carlton, toward Keel, toward a narrower circle of trusted people. The coincidences were too consistent. Her anger, once chaotic, became clear. It wasn't paranoia, it was architecture. Someone was building something around her. That realization felt like betrayal at a cellular level because it meant her trust had not merely been abused, it had been engineered. The first negative reaction was isolation. Nicole withdrew from people she could have relied on because she feared the infection of the lie had spread further. She began to watch everyone, including herself, with suspicion. Her mind turned into a courtroom where every memory became evidence. Each time she replayed a moment with Carlton, the warmth, the patience, the sense of being understood, she felt both furious and ashamed. Furious because she could see how he had used intimacy as a tool. Ashamed because she could feel the part of herself that had wanted it to be real. That shame turned sharp, and sharp shame often becomes cruelty. Nicole's temper flared in private settings, her composure thinning, her patience with mistakes evaporating. She felt herself becoming someone she disliked, harsher, colder, quicker to assume betrayal. The con was working even as she resisted it, because it was changing how she related to the world. Carlton, sensing Nicole's shift, responded with calculated pressure. He intensified the emotional stakes, positioning himself as the only stable ground in a world that suddenly felt hostile. He escalated the sense of urgency around the external threats he had helped manufacture, making Nicole feel that questioning him was dangerous, that doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. But beneath his controlled surface, Carlton's own anger began to grow. Not loud anger, but the resentful anger of someone who believes he deserves what he is taking. He convinced himself that Nicole's power had always been a kind of theft, that people like him and Keel were merely redistributing influence. He told himself that Nicole had been protected by privilege and status, and therefore she owed something. This justification hardened him, and the harder he became, the more he risked revealing himself. Kial, on the other hand, reacted to Nicole's resistance with contempt. He had no interest in emotional nuance. He saw Nicole's growing suspicion as an insult, a challenge, and challenges had to be crushed. He began to consider preemptive damage control, not just against Nicole, but against Carlton in case Carlton lost his nerve. Kial's motivations were colder and more dangerous because he did not need to be loved or admired. He only needed to win. He began to collect insurance, quietly gathering the very material he could later use to destroy both Nicole and Carlton if necessary. In his mind, loyalty was simply a tool to gain access, and once access was secured, loyalty was optional. That mindset made him unpredictable, and unpredictability is the most lethal ingredient in a carefully planned con. Nicole became trapped between two threats: the polished betrayal that wanted her compliance, and the ruthless betrayal that wanted her silence. She could sense the tightening, the way her options were narrowing. If she moved too openly, she risked triggering Kial's retaliation. If she stayed too quiet, she risked Carlton completing the final transfer of power. And the worst part was the psychological corner. Nicole knew that if she accused them without absolute proof, she would be dismissed as emotional, paranoid, unstable, labels that could destroy her credibility faster than any financial scheme. Carlton and Kial had designed it that way. They didn't just want to deceive her, they wanted to make her fear that telling the truth would ruin her. That fear ignited a darker anger in Nicole, an anger not just at them, but at the system that would punish her for defending herself. The conflict forced her into the kind of hard decision that changed a person. She could either remain the composed figure everyone expected, risking her own destruction to preserve her image, or she could abandon her carefully curated restraint and act like a cornered animal. Nicole's pride fought her survival instinct. Her pride insisted that she should outsmart them elegantly, prove her superiority without getting dirty. Her survival instinct insisted that elegance was a trap, that the only way to survive a con was to burn it down before it finished tightening around her. As Nicole's internal war intensified, Carlton and Kial's partnership frayed further.
Carlton began to fear that Kial's escalating aggression would expose them both. Kial began to view Carlton's desire to keep Nicole emotionally stable as weakness. Their separate motives collided, and in that collision, mistakes began to appear. Small ones, but real. A document arrived too quickly. A signature was placed where it shouldn't have been. A timeline mismatch surfaced. Nicole noticed. Each inconsistency became a spark, and Nicole gathered those sparks with the quiet intensity of someone preparing to set a fire. She did not need a confession. She needed one moment, one undeniable link that would let her move without being dismissed. She waited with the kind of patience that came from fury refined into focus. Meanwhile, the atmosphere around all three characters turned poisonous. Carlton's need for control became more desperate and more visible. Kial's contempt grew sharper, and he began to act like someone already planning the next betrayal. Nicole's anger began to harden into a dangerous calm. The more they pushed her, the less she reacted outwardly, and the less she reacted outwardly, the more they underestimated the violence of her internal resolve. Nicole started to think in terms of sacrifice. She began to consider what she was willing to lose in order to win. She began to realize that if Carlton and Kial were truly set on destroying her, then preserving every relationship, every reputation, every facade might no longer be possible. In Fairmont Crest, survival sometimes required choosing which parts of yourself you were willing to burn. By the time the trap reached its most claustrophobic point, none of them were the same as they had been at the beginning. Carlton had become too invested in the idea of owning Nicole's world to retreat. Kial had become too addicted to leverage to stop. Nicole had become too angry to remain polite. And all three were standing on the edge of a collapse that would not be clean, because the kind of deception they built couldn't end with a simple exposure. It would end with casualties, careers ruined, alliances shattered, private humiliations turned public, and at least one person forced to choose between revenge and survival. Nicole could feel the wall behind her, and she understood the final cruelty of their plan. They wanted her to panic. They wanted her to lash out first, so they could call her unstable.
So she held her rage like a blade and prepared to make a move that would either free her or destroy everything she had built. Because if Carlton and Kial thought she would fold quietly, they had mistaken her restraint for weakness, and she was finally ready to teach them what cornered really meant.